has the capacity to build the global world. Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to this weekend edition of the program. It is a global insider on this discursive and knowledge sharing program. On today's edition, we center on the theme Media Amidst Complex Global Crisis, with particular attention to the theme of the World Press Freedom Day 2024 that accentuated on journalism in the face of environmental crisis, challenges and opportunities, thus in light of the current global economical environmental crisis. World Press Freedom Day 2024 underscores the crucial role journalism and freedom of expression play in shaping public understanding and action in this dispensation, or in the dispensation of their various jobs. Journalists face a myriad of challenges in reporting on environmental issues and ensuring accuracy, accountability, and transparency in their coverage. Environmental journalists, particularly, who report on illegal activities including logging, mining, wildlife trafficking, corruption, and many more, face significant threats. The journalists are either threatened, silenced, killed, or denied access to factual information that will make news giving more practical and authentic, and of course that could help to shape the global world order. According to the United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres, in his message on the occasion of the World Press Freedom Day 2024, journalists of diverse niches have met scaring challenges in the pursuit of their career, from reporting environmental issues to reporting in the war zones, and equally zooming on societal problems affecting global peace and security. As per report, the Israel onslaught has killed about 142 journalists and media personalities in the Gaza Strip. The figures actually do not include the ones who have been engulfed in the proxy or the West proxy war in Ukraine, without forgetting Syria and Cameroon and elsewhere across the globe that have recorded, of course, some journalists dying as far as they are actually in the pursuit of their duties. So today's program, therefore, dwells on the opportunities and challenges for media practitioners. How can we promote communication for development in a more complex world, and also check the available scope for journalists worldwide to help in shaping global world order? Stay with us, and this is Global Insight. Thank you again for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. You are on to the Pan-African television. It is for you, Media Africa. And today we are accentuating on the place of the media in contemporary society towards solving the complex global crisis, looking at, of course, the theme for the 2024 World Press Freedom Day that accentuated on the role of journalists in solving environmental crisis. But we're not going to focus just on the environment, but we're looking at the media holistically in actually communicating for development, and looking at if the scope also is very fertile for journalists and other media practitioners to help in solving the complex world problems which we have just cited in the preamble. Together with a panel of experts, we're going to get into greater details to understanding the primary role of the media and, of course, other stakeholders involved in shaping policies across the global world, and seeing how the media and journalists in particular can help to mitigate the adverse consequences of the activities of men on the environmental of course, and also seeing how media reporting or news giving can mitigate the adverse consequences that we see in the global world at large, and how can media organs or institutions fight propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation in contemporary society. It is Global Insight, and this is what we're going to engage today. We take you straight away to Poland. We're being joined by MATEUSZ PISKORSKI, who is a political scientist, and of course he's joining to give more insight on this topic for discussion this year. To note that he is also a publisher for a Polish newspaper. I think it's actually the Truth of Poland. Hello to you, MATEUSZ, and welcome to the program Global Insight.
Thank you very much for your invitation, and welcome.
It's always a pleasure, and also thank you for accepting to be with us this day. We are going to the United States of America to acknowledge the presence of Otto Mobley, a journalist who doubles also as a historian. And thank you, Mr. Mobley, for joining us this day.
The world is going through an unprecedented environmental emergency, which poses an existential threat to these and future.
Well,
yeah, thank you. Welcome to the program.
absolutely, and thank you, and greetings to all my family there in the African continent and Europe and the rest of the world.
It's always a pleasure that we are here today to discuss things of mature actually understanding, and to note that the media has the capacity to bring about global peace and stability. To Algeria, we're being joined by Professor LAEED ZAGHLAMI, who is from the Algiers University Faculty of Information and Communication. Hello, Professor LAEED. It's a pleasure having you this day.
It's my pleasure too, Clarice, and to your guests for today's debate on media or amidst the complex global crisis. I will be very delighted to take part in this debate.
Indeed, of course, we are also happy to have you on this platform. This day, Steve GILL from the US will be joining us in the course of the program. Before we enter into the analysis of our topic for discussion, let's listen to the message of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, a strong message that he delivered on the occasion of the 2024 World Press Freedom Day, accentuating on the challenges faced by journalists across the global world, and of course urging government and other institutions to give journalists, media men and personalities the opportunity to have access to information and of course help in the process of news giving. Let's listen to him, and I'll join you right after that.
The world is going through an unprecedented environmental emergency, which poses an existential threat to these and future generations. People need to know about these, and journalists and media workers have a key role in informing and educating them. Local, national, and global media outlets can highlight stories about the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and environmental injustice. Through their work, people come to understand the plight of our planet and are mobilized and empowered to take action for change. Media workers also document environmental degradation, and they provide evidence of environmental vandalism that helps to hold those responsible to account. It is no surprise that some powerful people, companies, and institutions will stop at nothing to prevent environmental journalists from doing their jobs. Media freedom is under siege, and environmental journalism is an increasingly dangerous profession. Dozens of journalists covering illegal mining, logging, poaching, and other environmental issues have been killed in recent decades. In the vast majority of cases, no one has been held to account. UNESCO reports that in the past 15 years, there have been some 750 attacks on journalists and news outlets reporting on environmental issues, and the frequency of such attacks is rising. Legal processes are also misused to censor, silence, detain, and harass environmental reporters, while a new era of climate disinformation focuses on undermining proven solutions, including renewable energy. But environmental journalists are not the only ones at risk. Around the world, media workers are risking their lives trying to bring us news on everything from war to democracy. I'm shocked and appalled by the high number of journalists killed in Israeli military operations in Gaza. The United Nations recognizes the invaluable work of journalists and media professionals to ensure that the public is informed and engaged. Without facts, we cannot fight mis and disinformation. Without accountability, we will not have strong policies in place. Without press freedom, we won't have any freedom. A free press is not a choice, but a necessity. Our World Press Freedom Day is very important. And so I call on governments, the private sector, and civil society to join us in reaffirming our commitment to safeguarding press freedom and the rights of journalists and media professionals around the world.
And that was the United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres accentuating on the place of journalism and, of course, how we need to provide a better scope for journalists across the global world to solve the interconnected problems faced by countries around the world. We're going to kickstart into the analysis with you, MATEUSZ. Let's first of all throw more light into the message of the UN Chief Antonio Guterres. When you listen to him, what can you analyze further? Of course, he highlighted that media freedom is under siege, and of course, highlighting some of the atrocities that media personalities have faced in contemporary society. So how can we ensure a sustainability in providing the better scope for media personalities, taking the point pointed out by the UN chief?
Well, first and foremost, I would start with the fact that only now in my country, in Poland, there are several journalists who are detained or even arrested, who spent last years in detention centers. Mainly, I mean, the journalists who are covering somehow the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine, because, as you know, geographically, it's closest to us, to Poland. Nevertheless, I think that the violations against freedom of speech, against media activity in the so-called Western countries are equally numerous as the violations about which we hear in non-Western countries. So, unfortunately, United Nations, including the Secretary General, are, let's say, blind, at least on the one eye, when it comes to the violations of the rights and laws of journalists in the so-called Western countries. Unfortunately, they have no instruments, regardless the fact that Secretary General Guterres has acknowledged the fact of violations of fundamental rights of the press and of press collaborators. They are, as United Nations, unable at the moment being to implement any kind of regulations which would really protect the safety, the security of those who are working for the media, of those who are working for the press. That's the problem of implementation. Of course, the analysis is 100% right. I mean, the diagnosis of the Secretary General. Nevertheless, I haven't heard that the United Nations would, for instance, try to work out a new concept, a new charter for protection of journalists in different countries. United Nations, unfortunately, is helpless when it comes to this matter. It is helpless also when it comes to other matters. You perfectly know, you mentioned the conflict in Gaza Strip, so this is another example when you have even the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council, which are not observed by main actors, main players in different geopolitical conflicts. That's only the one example, I mean, in the Gaza Strip. I don't know really what could be the way to protect journalists' rights. Maybe we should think about some, let's say, common charter outside the framework of United Nations. Maybe we should think about proposing different guarantees on the national level, on the level of the countries being United Nations members. But first and foremost, we should give first place to solidarity among the journalists. Because I'm pretty sure that you haven't heard in United States, in Algeria, in Cameroon, about the fact that, for instance, in my country, in Poland, there is a Spanish journalist who has spent 2 years in prison just for nothing, without any court decision, because he was accused of, let's say, working for the information war on the Russian side of the Ukrainian conflict. Yes, you don't know about such facts. That's why I think that it's probably crucial to create a network of independently thinking journalists who would just speak about the violations, all the cases from all over the world, from different continents. And that's the first step I could propose. Of course, it won't solve the situation completely, yes, but nevertheless, we should just exchange information about different violations.
Absolutely, it is imperative to exchange information about different violations. And if we can look at the role of the media or journalists in solving these complex global crises, then the scope will be made greater for them to carry on with their dispensation. We continue with you, Prof.LAEED, in your capacity as a communication expert. We are today looking at the role of the media holistically, and in the context of complex geopolitical crisis. We see the crisis in the Middle East, and in our preamble we highlighted about over 100 journalists who have died in the course of the crisis just in the Middle East. And then we are looking at other countries like Syria, Cameroon, elsewhere in the world that have equally recorded such instances of deaths, or even unaccounted disappearances of journalists. So the question is, as a media personality, how can we ensure that we respect the primary role of the media, and give the stakeholders the opportunity to ensure communication for development in the present global context?
Thank you once again for having me on your program, and my
please, you're muted.
Regards. Sorry?
Can you hear me now? I can hear you now, Professor.
Sorry. Yeah. So I said thank you for having me on your program, as well as my regards to your guests. Well, regarding the media, let's make it clear from the beginning. The media, wherever they are operating, whether in capitalist countries, Western countries, or not Western countries, they are part of the political system in which they operate. And therefore, you can only, of course, say that they are part of the political system, and the political system which decide the fate, the way, the approach they are covering issues. And as you mentioned rightly, the situation in the Middle East, I think it's clear that Israeli occupation forces were behind the killing of over 150 journalists. after having killed 40,000 people. They don't care about journalists. They haven't cared for human beings in general. How they do care for journalists? And we have over 100,000 injured in what's happening now since 7th of October 2023. So if we have to blame, we have to blame this country who pretend to be democratic, but they have the support of USA, of Western countries in general. I think why Israel has not stopped from killing human beings, and then selectively they killed journalists, because nobody will bring them to justice. And they want, and they have the support, as I said, and the umbrella of USA. So here we are in a situation of frustration. On one hand, Western countries are brandishing, I would say, values of democracy, values of impartiality, values of freedom. But when it comes to their own principle, their own interests, they do not bother. So whether the situation is in Gaza Strip or in Syria or in Cameroon, there is what we call in the academic area agenda setting. What does it mean? It means those countries with their media, these media are deciding which are prominent, which is covered, which is not. And that's exactly what is happening. So some countries, or I would say some conflicts, are completely neglected while others are highlighted. And this is due to their selective and their, I would say, unfair approach of agenda setting. They set the news according to their interest. So here we are, unfortunately, the statement by the Secretary General Guterres is heard, but not implied and not implemented. Unfortunately, the freedom of the press, as we celebrated just 2 days ago or 24 hours ago, the World Day for freedom of the press, this initiative of freedom of the press came to the declaration of Windhoek in Namibia in 1991. Can you imagine? Africa was behind at the forefront of defending freedom of the press. But unfortunately, of course, right now, 30 years later, still there is a breach of freedom. What happened that media in general are, I would say Western countries are having the monopoly of the media in the world affairs, in the world I would say landscape, and therefore they decided who is right, who is not wrong, and nobody, unfortunately, now we see so many conflicts, so many crises taking place in the world, and of course the media can only but observe and report all the casualty we see right now.
Thank you for the introductory statement, Professor LAEED. We'll get into some of the peculiarities of the media world. We continue with you, Author Mobley. You know, today when Professor LAEED was actually highlighting the aspect of agenda setting, it actually touched the next question, which I was directing to you. We are in a world of complex global crisis. We are looking at the environmental issues like we contacted or listed logging, illegal mining, and corruption. And of course, now we want to see the world, the crisis in the Ukraine and in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the Middle East crisis, and then the place of the media, especially mainstream media, that actually maybe advance the aspect or the theory of agenda setting in changing narratives. Regarding the developments in the global world, how have these actually affected the global peace and maybe the mutual maybe resolution of crisis in the global world? Let's take particularly the proxy war in Ukraine and the happenings.
in the Middle East.
in the Middle East.
2023 was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global peace. It was a very difficult year for the global pe
Thank you, Clarice. And your distinguished guests have highlighted some really important things concerning journalism, both locally in conflict zones and internationally. It's very important that we step back and take a look at what is journalism? What is the role of journalists around the world in whatever one of these situations we find ourselves in? It's to bring information back to the rest of the world in a unfiltered and accountable way, so that we are bringing the facts, the information, the data that people need to make competent decisions about what their response and what their reaction should be to these various situations. I can speak very strongly to journalism in the U.S. I've been a journalist in the U.S. for 40 years, and I've worked in a number of disciplines, radio, television. I published newspapers. I've owned radio stations and outlets in the United States and served on academic boards like the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, which I served on that board for 27 years. I understand what the objectives are in the United States in terms of supposedly what we advance as journalism. Journalism in the U.S. was designed to be a branch of the government. You have the executive branch, which is the president of the United States. You've got your judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court in the United States, and the legislative branch. And then the fourth branch of government, in the way it was supposed to work, in the way it is supposed to work, was the journalist and the media, the press, is often called the fourth estate for that reason in the U.S. But the fourth estate is not intended to be a branch of government that operates as a propaganda arm of the government, but it is supposed to be the voice of the people. It is supposed to be that that arm of public interest that says, we are watching what is going on in the other branches of government. We're watching what's going on in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And we're going to interpret and explain that to the public in a way that is helpful to them in an unbiased way. If you take that same concept and extend it around the world, then journalists should be protected. Journalists should be immune from being targeted. Journalists should be immune from these aggressive acts that we see, and the proliferation of the numbers, sheer numbers of journalists being targeted and killed, I think is just certainly it's very wrong, but it's also endemic of how people are responding to the role of journalists. Journalists used to be these impartial people who stood around when they had their press credentials, and people were supposed to, or combatants on either side were supposed to leave the journalists alone. They were supposed to treat the journalists as though they were just an object there that was not involved in the conflict. But the mistake came when many jurisdictions, many governments decided to use and manipulate the role of the journalist. They started using the journalist role to send out undercover attachés or spies in the role of journalists. And that created a lot of danger for journalists. And it's created this world that we have today where journalists have become the targets instead of the reporters of the world, of what's going on in these conflicts, and sharing that information with their respective audiences.
Which becomes very problematic. Like we said, the media set the agenda, and of course an agenda for peace will ensure global peace and stability. And coming back to you, MATEUSZ, we have actually identified some of the challenges and opportunities of the media world in seeing how we can mitigate the effects of the global crisis in the world. Now, let's look at the definition of news, which stands as the actual representation of facts, and will bring us to making an appraisal of what is happening in the world. You know, the world has actually experienced some evolvement from a unipolar to a multipolar world, where we see ideologies changing, philosophies changing as well. And even as the world is evolving, the world of information is evolving. And instead of actually solving, maybe respecting this primary objective of news giving that gives out factual news, the world is today, or the society today, has recorded high level of propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation, which is largely coming from mainstream media. Now, with all of these already on the know, because of the availability of on-the-ground reporting from journalists and other experts who try to appraise the actual situation on the ground, how can we now counteract this propaganda that is helping to put the world in further crisis?
First and foremost, I think that we should give to all those things their right names. You mentioned a few very important notions from the point of view of political sciences, social sciences, journalism as well, maybe particularly the information sphere of human activities. First one is propaganda, as you mentioned. Well, honestly speaking, if you look at the Latin roots of the word propaganda, it's neither false nor true. I mean, the statements of any kind of propaganda are neither false nor true by definition. Propaganda is about propagating something, yes? So you might have an idea, a narrative which you prefer, a worldview which you prefer. So basically every politician, almost every man who has any kind of worldview, any kind of political ideology, propagates something, yes? Of course, nowadays we abuse the word propaganda. We condemn our adversaries for, we accuse them of using propaganda, but we are doing it ourselves. I mean, everyone commenting on politics, on economics, uses some kind of propaganda because propagates something. But there are two other notions, very, very important, and by the way, very dangerous, which you have mentioned, and I'm very glad that you told about them. It's disinformation and misinformation. Yes? If I would say, well, I'm now in Poland, and outside on the street you cannot see that, but it's a very sunny weather today here in my country. Nevertheless, if I would say that the weather today is ugly, would that be disinformation or not? Well, personally, I think it wouldn't be any kind of disinformation, because perhaps I personally prefer, and I have such a right, yes, as a citizen and as a free man, maybe I prefer rainy weather. Yeah? So it's just opinion. It's just opinion, not disinformation. But if I would say that it's raining outside, of course, that would be pure disinformation, yes? And we have to make that difference. Why? Because nowadays, if you look at the most renowned media of the Western world, take, for instance, BBC, yes, which used to be perceived as one of the most unbiased media in the whole world for decades. Nevertheless, if you look at the content of those media, the journalists and the editors, and that's a big problem, I guess, have lost the ability to make a difference between opinion and information. Yeah? So you watch news at mainstream TV stations, and you hear just opinions and interpretations. Yes. Meanwhile, even on the first year of a journalist's course at any university in the world, it should be taught that, well, information is one thing, and then you collect some comments on the given information. And we have lost these abilities to keep all those fundamental notions, fundamental for journalism, alive. And that's, I think, the starting point. We should start with definitions, with coming to true definitions which exist in social sciences, which exist in theory, but we have just, I mean, not us here, yes, but unfortunately, I think that the majority of the mainstream journalists and editors have forgotten about those definitions. And that should be also one thing about which we should, on a theoretical level, but on the practical level as well, as independent journalists, we should remember and remind the others those basic notions, basic definitions, and basic principles as well of any journalistic activity. That would be a first point, I guess.
Thank you so much, Mateusz. And actually, misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda are words that are commonly used today, and when it comes to the media landscape. And it is imperative for us to look at the effect or the consequences of these in ensuring global peace and security, in actually reducing the number of war of words that are actually across the global world. Let me come back to you, to MOBLEY, still on the aspect of information, propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. I want us to accentuate on a recent example. You know, in the March of 2024, the Russian Federation went to the polls to cast a ballot, and just to say that for you, Media Africa actually was present on the field, and particularly in the Donbass. But after the election proper, we saw information from mainstream media to note that these media organs were not present on the field, categorically stating that people voted in Donetsk and other parts of the region under, you know, duress, like at gunpoint. So why do we try to maybe place disinformation, misinformation, propaganda in this, and how are these negative aspects of the 3 points or words helping to bring the global world in disarray?
Well, it's a good point. Propaganda is going to occur because we have people who are intent on making sure that the narrative is controlled. Various countries, various media groups jockey for control of the narrative, and that's an unfortunate byproduct of journalism. But if we want to get to a point, again, where we have a kind of a sanctity in journalism, where journalists are protected, therefore, and are looked at as being unbiased, and are looked at as being really the arbiters of information that get out factual information to the public, regardless of where that public is, and allow them to make decisions based on that synthesized factual information, then we're going to have to rethink how we advance certain journalists and how we, what qualifies as a journalist? You know, what what media organizations are looked at as being independent. You say the mainstream media. That's become a catch-all phrase for just media that's corporate controlled and that is more prone to inducing propaganda. Here in the U.S., I was part of a long struggle for a long time in this country to get ownership of media outlets, because licenses for radio and television and even to a lesser extent print media is not so much a product of the capital that you can raise, but those licenses were supposed to be given out equitably among all the people in the country so that you get a fair reflection of what's coming back from all of the people. And I just expand this and extend this all over the world. Media should be owned by the people. It should be representative of what the people need and require. And if their government is wrong, the media should have the presence and the right and the duty to inform the public of those things that are happening in their own government that are not beneficial to the public good. That's just the role of, that should be the role of media. And if that were the role of media, we would have less of a propensity for people inside a particular government, say. You mentioned what was going on in Ukraine and in the Donbass region, the votes that they took there. That's an East-West propaganda nightmare waiting to happen. There is going to be this tug of war for not only the information that is fed into that community, but how we outside of the community will interpret those issues, the information that we get about those particular incidents. And that happens all over the world. So we have to clean up as journalists and as various governments around the world what the role of journalists are if we want to truly get back to a immunity, a protection of journalists. So I think we've got a lot of introspective house cleaning to do in the journalism industry, and we also have to be very reflective from a governmental standpoint. If we're allowing our journalists to go out around the world, then those journalists need to be protected. The United Nations can assist in creating serious protections. They can start by making it a criminal offense to harm a journalist, to hurt a journalist. So there's some things that should be done, that can be done from the UN standpoint and from general governments around the world.
And of course, it's something that should be actually considered. And the United Nations chief pointed that in his message, urging journalists and institutions to provide governments and the institutions to provide journalists and media personalities with the right scope or the access to information that they need. But then, what is the feasibility of this, given that some of these institutions or some governments are not always very ready to leave journalists with the right information that they need. Coming back to you, Professor LAEED, we are looking here at the media, which consists of journalists and other expert media personalities. Now, the question, we are looking at the changing times and the media plurality, which I'll say has actually increased in the 21st century, and we see particularly, I want to bring us to the African continent and the wind of change that is blowing. How can we give an appraisal, or what appraisal can we give to the media landscape in Africa for actually helping in bringing about the reawakening in the minds of Africans that we today see the continent wanting to take its own future or its own issues personally and advocate African solutions to African problems. I want to highlight the revolution, political revolution across especially countries in the Sahel region. Also to look at how very categorical African government, the leadership of Uganda recently decried some of the multinational institutions, especially financial institutions across the African continent, about there's some appellations that they actually use when trying to engage with countries in Africa, and of course defining the term sustainable development and everything. So I want to look at the role of the African media in bringing about this consciousness across the African continent, and how can the media work properly towards taking the continent to proper development and total transformation.
Thank you. Let me first of all say hello
Professor
to
LAEED.
Steve, who just joined us. Hi, Steve. So there are some things we have to bear in mind.
Professor LAEED,
News
please, are you with us?
sacred. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. I am in mute, don't worry, it's okay. So I'm telling you, news are sacred, commands are free. So departing from this statement, we have to observe, we have to obey by the news values. When it comes to news, it's sacred, and of course we talk about what really happened now without any misinformation or disinformation. These two aspects appeared after the advent of social media as well as internet, and we talk now about fake news and post-truth. This is the new concept emerged after the proliferation of diversity and pluralism in the world. It's worth recalling people that African countries, as I said, which and exactly in Namibia, in the Windhoek capital of Namibia, which saw the declaration of freedom in the world started. Since that, nothing has been reached, unfortunately. We spoke afterwards of the new order of information and communication, new order of world information communication. So again, this appeal, this call to the whole community in the world, they didn't bother to take at least consider it. So when it comes to Africa now, I am pleased to let you know that next week, and exactly on the 8th of May, there will be all media summit in Africa, and it will be held in Kenya, in Nairobi. So that is to say, Africa is considering its own sovereignty, its own way of reporting on the continent. We have so many, I would say, associations working on the media in Africa. We have African Media Initiative, as well All Africa Media Summit, which, as I said to you, which is composed of main leaders in Africa, and they are really aware of this. They are looking for the independence of Africa in terms of economy, in terms of finance, in political as well as media. So, in other words, what is happening now, there is really, as you mentioned it, a clear awareness and consciousness of African people and African media professionals. Of course, they are working in relation with the African Union and other African Union organizations, whether are Regional Economic Commission or so forth. So I am confident that the African journalists, the African media professionals are aware that they have over their burden the necessity to deliver sincere and objective information to, of course, remove all sorts of constraint and pressure, whether economic pressure or financial pressure or so forth. I'm talking to you the example of Algeria since the advent of the president, the new president in 2019, after years of after many years of corruption and mismanagement and all kind of misinformation, Algeria now has started sincere and very objective media policy. Likewise, because in our constitution now, for instance, there is an article called Article 54. In this Article 54, it gives freedom of the press the constitutional guarantee that nobody will dare to remove it. In other words, everyone now has to respect the freedom of the press. Then afterwards, what happened? Last year, there was a new, of course, law on information, what we call organic information, in which stipulate everything one should do, whether for journalists, whether the public authorities, whether for the owner of press. Also, there is another law on information on the news or journalism in press, in written press and journal and electronic, as well as in audiovisual. In other words, I'm sure more than that, there will be another, what we call ethical council for deontology. So there are so many structures and authorities, all of them try to of course, to tackle this issue of, otherwise, to promote, I would say, professionalism, to promote transparency and to promote efficiency. And in other words, to let people to reflect the interest and the concept of everybody. And for sure, as you mentioned it, there are so many actors in Africa, and unfortunately, we have to accept Africa has tried early 70s and 80s to have its own African news agency, but unfortunately, for lack of money, it didn't last longer. But again, there will be an opportunity to promote that. But as I said, and we continue to say, African media professionals are aware that they should report on their problem, of course, and we don't expect to have coverage from whether Western media, whether French agence, France Press, or Reuters, or any other United UPI or Associated Press, or whether television, CNN or BBC. They should have their own media outlet to defend themselves.
Absolutely, which is very imperative, and it winds down also to on-the-ground reporting that gives first-hand and factual information. I think Steve Gill just joined us now from the United States. He's a political commentator who doubles as a radio host. You're welcome to the program, Steve. We are looking at the role of the media, broadcast, print media, digital. Now we are looking at the media in the aspect of amidst complex global crisis. And we want to bring you with this question of how journalists can navigate the complex landscape of reporting. Let's accentuate on the theme which dwells actually on environmental landscape of reporting on environmental issues, and while maintaining the values of accuracy, accountability, and transparency, especially when facing threat and censorship. I would love that you answer this question pertaining the Russia-Ukraine crisis and also the problems in the Middle East. You know, when we look at all of these happening and the proxy war happening in the Middle East and elsewhere, and the voice of U.S. President Joe Biden, who actually pointed out decrying that journalists have been killed in the Middle East, and mostly Palestinian journalists and elsewhere around. How can we actually make a correlation between the statements like Prof.LAEED said, policies, and of course meeting or the actual situation on the ground, so that the media personalities can have a healthier scope to be able to maybe go ahead with the pursuit of their career in news giving, and also uncovering some of these illegal activities that are very harmful to the environment?
Well, thank you, Clarice, for having me, and it's good to see my friend Prof.LAEED as well. I think one of the things that to me, when you cover international news, there's an old saying: it's not personal, it's just business. But I think when we're covering news, it is personal. And if we know people like you in Africa, Prof.LAEED in Algeria, and others that we've gotten to know over the years, you have sources on the ground that you trust to tell you what is going on, so that you can actually accurately tell the story. And while it is sometimes dangerous to go into these conflict zones, that's where you get the real story. And too often, what I think media does is not that they always cover things in the wrong way. It's what they choose not to cover that is the real problem, I think, in modern journalism. They censor by what they choose not to cover, rather than even silencing voices or silencing the issues that might matter. They just don't cover the story. It's not sexy enough. It's not, the visuals matter, obviously, in television. So I think a lot of what doesn't get covered is a problem. And the best way to handle that is to go there, to where it's happening, and be able to tell the folks back home the truth. As you mentioned, Clarice, I was in Russia twice for elections in September in the Donbass region, and then again more recently in the presidential elections. The Western media isn't covering the Russian elections. They're certainly not covering what's going on in Donetsk and in the Ukrainian-Russia conflict. You know, they'll put reporters into Gaza, they'll put reporters in Israel, but there are no reporters from Western media that are reporting from the Russian side of that conflict. So we're getting one side of the story, the same way that we got one side of the story during COVID, the same way we get one side of the story when they're reporting on Gaza and Israel. When the media is picking a side, we know they're not telling us the truth. And the only way to get the real truth is to go there, see it, and again, at sometimes a personal risk. I embedded with U.S. troops in Iraq twice, and while my family wasn't happy with that, the soldiers and the guys on the ground knew that the real story was being told because somebody was actually there, not staying in some hotel in the green zone or reporting from America. Again, like we saw with these Russian elections recently, the West is reporting, oh, they are sham elections, they are fake elections. But I didn't see anybody from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, any of the Western media. They were not there. They're just reporting the propaganda that serves their purposes.
Talking about propaganda serving their purposes, I'll stay with you, Steve. You were highlighting. It brings us to mind. You were in Russia 2 times, like you've mentioned. You will attest that after journalists and some international experts visited the region to appraise the situation, like we underlined as some the other guests before you joined already underlined. On the ground reporting makes us to have a better, clearer appraisal of situations, and to have first-hand information from the citizens or those directly affected by the crisis. The question is, in his message, the United Nations chief called on governments and other institutions to provide a better scope for journalists and other media personalities to gather information on some of the problems affecting the global world. You attest that after the group of experts and other journalists visited these regions, there were some sort of communiques urging that these media personalities and experts be handed some sanctions. How does this come to undermine the practice of journalism, and of course, and how can maybe government policies correlate with the demands of the media world in the aspects of communicating for development, communicating for peace, and ensuring that we mitigate the adverse effects of the misunderstanding across the global world?
Well, even if sanctions aren't actually imposed against journalists or foreign experts who go and observe and report, it's the threat that is intended to silence and intimidate. And I think it has an effect on many, particularly in countries where they may not have the variety of platforms to communicate what they saw. So when you have Western media, the United States, Europe, declaring that the presidential election in Russia was a sham and that President Putin is an illegitimate leader, when they question the people of Venezuela who will be voting for their own presidency with President Maduro on the ballot, when the West is picking losers and picking winners in how they report or how they threaten reporters who accurately report, then that's not going to increase either the credibility of the media or the accuracy of what people know as they're making policy decisions. You see U.S. members of Congress traveling to Ukraine to visit with President Ukraine, all the time, media celebrities, entertainment celebrities. Nobody's going onto the Russian side and reporting what's actually happening to the citizens in eastern Ukraine and in Donbass, in Donetsk, in Luhansk, and in these other areas that are being shelled by Ukraine with U.S. weapons. They're not reporting that. And so the American public, the Western European public, doesn't have the truth. And democracy only works if you have an informed and engaged election crew, the people. And if they're not informed, if they're misinformed, they can't be properly engaged. So I don't think there's a more important issue in the world right now. Again, we've got military conflicts, we've got poverty, we've got a lot of issues, the environment. But there's not, to me, a more important issue than making sure that we have a substantive, accurate, transparent media that is covering and reporting the truth, even if it's unpleasant to government officials. That's the only way that we can deal with any of these issues, is if people are informed and allowed to get the truth.
It's about to get the truth and make a better appraisal of situations, and that will reduce the actually anger that exists between nations of the world, bringing us to the bone of contention. MATEUSZ, I'm coming back to you in Poland. We're looking at the bone of contention, that is the interest of politicians and the media freedom. And we're talking about the world celebrating the world press freedom. And of course, we begin to ask if there's actually freedom of the press, and if you actually talk, is your freedom guaranteed after the investigation, the results of an investigation carried out by journalists or other experts that engage in bringing the truth to the fore. Now, let's look at this. When Arthur MOBLEY was talking earlier on, he identified journalism as a very important tool in the United States as far as the structure of the country is concerned. Now, in contemporary society, with a lot of changes which have occurred, and especially along the lines of international relations, where we see the quest for power and control becoming more and more intense between politicians, how do these politicians undermining the media freedom, because giving maybe a freedom to the media, it actually counteracts their political ambitions and bringing us to a bone of contention or a state of uncertainty between reconciling the interests of politicians and the right to information that the population needs to be able to decide or maybe make practical decisions that will determine the future of the country?
Well, that's a very important question, but I would say we have a kind of hybrid censorship, such as at the moment being, it's very important. It's not purely state censorship. It's not purely the liberties to information, to getting and also giving some information, publishing information. These are not restrictions which are created by the state itself, but also by the corporations. So I would say that some countries and some political elites, regardless the fact that they are still referring to liberal democracy referring to universal values, which are actually not universal, but Western or Anglo-Saxon even. Regardless all those facts, there's a kind of hybrid censorship which is implemented by the state and by the corporations cooperating with that state. It's a matter of analyzing separate countries and defining if the state is more powerful, the politicians are more powerful in a given country, or the capital, or somehow, sometimes even very often foreign capital in a given country, or corporation like, the equity funds like corporations such huge as BlackRock and the others, yes? But, well, of course, the politicians in several countries, unfortunately, are not now, let's say, responsible for the policy, also for the policy when it comes to the media and to the freedom of speech, because they themselves are controlled by some corporations or foreign powers. Of course, our American friends know definitely better than I know the term and the notion of deep state. We read a lot about the American deep state, although actually the term itself comes from Turkey, according to political scientists. Nevertheless, we talk a lot about the deep state in the United States. We remember the books of Peter Scott Dale and other renowned academics in the United States who spoke about deep state. But we have the same deep state structures, however you call that, in most of the countries, unfortunately in most of the Western countries. So it's not the politicians we see often that decide to limit our freedom, including the freedom of speech and freedom of press, but other more covert forces. When it comes to official censorship, because you mentioned in your question, let's say the political side of this censorship, I would say that officially before 2022, before February 2022, we had no officially censorship in Western countries, in my country, in Poland, yes? After the Russian intervention or the Russian operation in Ukraine, we faced the comeback, a true comeback of censorship as a process, as a procedure implemented officially against free media and freedom of speech in our countries. One interesting fact, we have our distinguished American guests and participants here. Well, lucky you are in the United States, because as far as I know, at least, there is no blockade of websites and internet pages of Russian media, right, in the United States. But here in European Union, unfortunately, according to the decision of European Commission from March 2022, we have already official censorship, which means that several media, first and foremost, of course, Russian media, but also Belarusian, but also I think in the future it will concern also the Chinese media, maybe the Iranian media as well, are simply blocked. So people to get access to them have to use VPN or other instruments, but it's more and more difficult just to get information. So official, formal state censorship has been reborn in 2022. But before, of course, we had censorship structures as well, but they were more, let's say, unofficial, informal, and were more, let's say, implemented by the corporations than by the states. Now we have definitely, again, the factor of political censorship in Europe.
Very problematic, Otto Mobley. I will allow you comment on the questions just asked by MATEUSZ to actually get the real state patterning of the media landscape in the U.S., patterning of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the availability of the media. And then we look at to what extent political rhetorics, especially in the international sphere, international relation, is trying to block the access of information to citizens and other vulnerable societies that could help in them ascertaining the real state or stakes of situations concerning them and the global world.
Well, again, thank you. And obviously, what we have going on right here, right now, with our participation on Global Insights is evidence that the world of technology has changed media internationally and will change it forever, for that matter. But we have to be very vigilant about what we do with media outlets around the world so that it is diversified. The problem in America has always been the diversity of ownership of media. You haven't heard from the full fabric of America forever in terms of voices from the media, the voices that we hear in the media, because it's corporate owned, because it is a product of who can purchase the radio stations and the TV stations and the media outlets. It creates a monodimensional viewpoint, even from the US. When you kill diversity of ownership, you kill diversity of voices, you kill the diversity of perspectives in the media. We talk about Russia and some of the countries, China and Eastern Bloc countries. We don't have any information coming out of many of these places. I mean, even where you look at China, which is supposed to be a major trading partner with the U.S., India, and Eastern Europe, for that matter, we get very, very little information out of those countries. And it's done because there is an attempt to shield the American public from what operationally is happening in these countries, what politically is happening in these countries, and social activity, et cetera. The U.S. just last week had an official ban signed by the President Biden, of TikTok. It is a blatant attempt to destroy and cripple the ability for people in the U.S. to receive information. They claim that it was because the Chinese had a backdoor and they could essentially glean information from the American public, and somehow the Chinese were going to use this personal information and data of people among the 170 million users of TikTok in the United States to somehow subvert democracy and something else and something else with the economy in the U.S. But again, we certainly realize and recognize that it was just a blatant attempt to destroy an informational avenue that the U.S. media doesn't have control over. If this channel were popular in the U.S., then there would be an effort to try and curtail the availability of this product in the U.S. So that's a problem, and it's a problem because of who owns the media. You can't have corporate ownership of the media completely across the boards, not allow for diversity in the media in any country, and expect to get a good reflective look at what is actually going on in the country That's what the public is interested in. People have the right to understand what is happening in their world and around them so that they can react and do the things that are in the public interest from their own standpoint, for the protection of their own communities and families. But we're being denied that and in America, and we're being denied that throughout the world and in Africa too. But I really wish efforts like this much success as we all move together and advance and create just a better communicative world as we move forward.
Indeed, it's about having a better communication world to be able to reconcile the major differences which are tearing the global world apart. Just to add to what you said, Mr. Mobley, you know, and in line also with what MATEUSZ said regarding media censorship since the start of the Russian special military operation in the Donbass. You know, while on the field in the Donbass to appraise the situation, having to discuss with people based in the US, they were like, take care, make sure that you are safe. And the question was, what is the problem? And like on the media landscape in the US has made it in such a way that anything coming from Russia seems to be so disastrous that it's not safe to be in the country. And I think Steve will comment on that when I come to you, because we want to look at how we will ensure communication that will not put fear in the hearts and minds of the population, but instead bring the truth closer to the people to make them understand the narratives and make a better judgment for the betterment of the global world. But before that, Steve, let me continue with Professor LAEED. Professor, while talking earlier on, you highlighted the pending All Africa Media Summit that will be holding, should be next week, in the Kenyan capital city of Nairobi. And we are looking at how we can solve some environmental problems, because if this year is accentuating on environmental issues, we want to think about some of these issues affecting the African continent. Are we going to mention the activities of the Shell company in the Niger Delta in Nigeria? You know, till date, the dwellers of this particular rich region are still living in misery. They are very susceptible, and with the contaminated waters and the fact that they have not benefited from the endowment of their region. We also look at the Chevron activities. You know, some of these pollutions and other activities that corporate organizations actually indulge, which they bring in negative consequences on the dwellers. We want to look at how institutions manipulate the media in order to cover up their illegal or the effects of their activities on the environment, and how this maybe is an aspect of corporate governance and corporate social responsibilities, with institutions wanting to gain a competitive advantage instead of practicing real corporate social responsibilities by giving the community that they are benefiting from what they need to prosper. Instead, the practice mimicry and some, to an extent, manipulate the media landscape to cover up these activities. How will the All Africa Summit address some of these activities and ensure that companies, especially foreign companies, engaging in exploration activities, even exploitation activities, logging around the continent Africa, should benefit the continent as well as it is benefiting the institutions?
Sure, Clarice. I wish if we can have next week another session on that particular summit, because it's very important. And as you put it rightly, of course, we spoke about in the 70s and 80s, Africa was calling from a new order, world order of information and communication. But unfortunately, that appeal didn't get any impact from Western countries, because in general, Western media want to have a monopoly of view, to advocate monopolistic view on world affairs. On the whole idea, in the whole idea, I would say they want to keep some kind of course, of monopoly on all over the world. And the All Africa Media Summit next week in Nairobi is, of course, doing its best to talk about why not to advocate a new information and communication approach for African countries themselves. And as you put it rightly, Africa needs now to develop a new lift, and of course to remove all obstruction or constraint, and to recover its own dignity, its own liberty of freedom. And there are 4 topics which will be discussed during that summit. One of them is dealing with which kind of media business we are talking about. So we are talking about, of course, what will be the business of media next for the coming years. Then the second one will be the media and African development and integration, as well as a human development. The third topic will be leadership and trust in Africa, and the last one, the standard in the age of disinformation and misinformation. As you may see from the agenda, from the 4th topic, which will be deeply and discussed during that summit, for sure there will be over 300. That's exactly a great number, 300 journalists, media professionals, leaders from the media and so forth from the continent. They will attend this summit, and for sure they are aware of the discrepancy in the world media, how the Africa is unfortunately not very negatively portrayed. There is a distortion about Africa. When you speak about African continent, the image of Africa is always about famine, about poverty, about coup d'etat, about disease, and so forth. This image should be removed now. And African countries, African people, African media professionals are very aware of this. And they have over their shoulder the responsibility to be Afro-optimism and not Afro-pessimism. The framework is already settled down by people in the African Union through Agenda 2063, which asks for prosper Africa, free Africa, developed Africa, unified Africa. Also, there is, in parallel with this general framework, we have another agenda. We have another agenda about Continental Free Trade Association. And the third main project for Africa is free movement for all Africans, with the aim of that all African will have an African passport. So there are very substantive and very tangible measures taken, and for sure African journalists, African media professionals are very aware of this. And if there is no some kind of cooperation between Africa and the rest of the world, Africa will have its own autonomy, its own leadership, and will defend itself, as you put it rightly, by its own people for the prosperity of Africa.
Indeed, for the prosperity of Africa and for the prosperity of the global world at large. Coming back to you, Steve Gill, listening to Professor LAEED highlighting the major stakes, and of course we see that the media landscape in Africa has taken another dimension. And before you joined, we were looking at the major stakes in the multipolar world, and of course the stakes in the media landscape. Now, with all of these in place, what do you think can be done to redefine, I don't know if I should put it as information diplomacy, to ensure that in a more globalized and interconnected world, the information circulating should make the world to be more connected rather than what we are seeing now, where the quest for power or wanting to remain, to be known as the world superpower, is actually bringing divergence across the global world, and it is affecting, making the media agenda, I beg your pardon, to also be seemingly biased per se in addressing some of these global issues.
Well, first of all, I want to say to Professor LAEED, I am excited to hear about this summit in Kenya, bringing a media continent of Africa, I think is incredibly important, and I'm excited to hear about that, because you're exactly right. Most Americans, when they think of Africa, think of famine and poverty and people in mud huts. They don't think about the skyscrapers and the modern cities that have sprung up throughout Africa, and the same thing's true in Russia. I've spent some time in Russia in the last year, and people in the U.S. think of these kind of cinder block, gray buildings that they see from their mindset of the 1960s or 70s of the Cold War. They have no idea what modern Russia, what modern Moscow looks like. And as Clarice said, people were expressing concern about her and us and others that were going to Russia to observe elections. And I had people saying, "Aren't you afraid to go to Moscow?" It's like, hey, I go to Memphis and Chicago. I mean, it's much safer than those cities in the United States. And then I also want to say that what Teresa and Mr. Mobley pointed out is that corporate ownership and the impact of that on U.S. media is a major problem. But when you have essentially government-run media in the U.S., whether it's NPR, for example, you get such a one-sided, left-sided perspective that is not balanced or diverse in kind of the reporting that takes place. There was a recent study that of the top officials at NPR, National Public Radio, funded by taxpayers, 87 were Democrat donors or voters. 0 were Republican donors or voters. There's not any diversity there, whether it's corporate ownership or essentially government run. And I would underline that part of the problem is not just corporate ownership. It's, as we say in the United States, follow the money. It's the advertising sales and the ability to buy coverage that big corporations and the military industrial complex have. When you have Pfizer buying ads on TV and radio stations throughout the country, it's not surprising that their news reporting is you have to get the vax that let Pfizer and others, Moderna, make billions of dollars on, that we're now learning that the vax wasn't as safe as we were told, was not as necessary as we were told, but we were getting one side of the story because Pfizer and Moderna and others were buying advertising. The same thing is true when you look at the conflict in Ukraine with Russia. On the Sunday morning political talk shows, there are advertisements from the same companies that make, jet fighter planes and bombs. They're not advertising F-16s on these Sunday morning shows because I'm going to go out and buy one, even if I'd like to. It's because they know the members of Congress are watching, and they want them to know that they have influence and impact with their advertising dollars. So I think the advertising is at least as big an issue as the corporate ownership. I would disagree with Mr. Mobley on one thing. I think the TikTok fight, if it's about national security, that's a legitimate concern. If it's about silencing a media outlet, then that's not legitimate. And I think it's not really clear what the real basis is. But in China, U.S. social media companies can't operate. If you leave Hong Kong and go across the bridge, social media cuts off. You can't get access. So if China's going to play by that set of rules, it does make some sense that the U.S. will say, we'll play by the same set of rules. If you're going to block our social media, we should block yours, even if it does silence, unfortunately, I think, voices that should be here. And blocking TikTok may stop them from seeing my really interesting dance videos, like so many of the TikTok videos tend to be. Finally, on that point, I would just say that we have the advantage of technology that's on our side. Mr. Mobley mentioned it as well. There are new platforms and vehicles to communicate, like this show. The challenge is, how do we get the eyeballs and the ears to hear shows like this, to see the alternate media that is exposing things that the mainstream media that, as LAEED and Mr. MATEUSZ mentioned, that are being silenced by the mainstream media and the deep state. Technology may be the way we win, but then you still have to find ways to attract eyeballs and ears to those outlets.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we are almost rounding off with the program. So we're going to have maybe a take-home message regarding our topic. Does they come back to you, MATEUSZ? Revisiting the concept of information or disinformation and misinformation, particularly in the mainstream media. Now, how can political scientists work together with maybe journalists to ensure their accurate and unbiased information is disseminated to the general public, especially in maybe in regions like countries like Poland, where media freedom may sometimes face challenges, as now, as you highlighted earlier on. Maybe 2 minutes.
Well, independent media are permanently accused of disseminating disinformation, misinformation, there's one more notion we haven't discussed, so it's misinformation. Thank you that you mentioned it. And they are also creating for state donations for different grants, not only the national ones, but also those sponsored by external players, by, let's say, George Soros-like foundations in our countries. So they organize centers for monitoring disinformation, which means actually they are not monitoring disinformation and warning against disinformation, but they are warning against views that are somehow different to the dominant narrative in a given country. It's not only about Poland, but other European countries as well. So maybe we should think about giving quite a similar answer, of course, within our possibilities, because we don't have such a potential as, for instance, George Soros and his funds have. Yes, but anyway, maybe we should think about organizing independent monitoring of the so-called mainstream media, fact-checking, building a kind of network. I think that the network might be a good answer to what is going on, to what is happening now. Yeah. I think that Steve Gill just told that we still have the possibility to talk here, for instance, today, using the technologies, yes? Of course, we can use those technologies. However, I fear that in the coming future, the corporations will do everything to limit our possibilities when it comes to using social media and other platforms. On the other hand, I also agree with you when it comes to the idea you have voiced that the multipolar world, the new world which is taking its shape on our eyes now, will enable us to remain independent. I mean, those media outlets, those journalists who want simply to be independent. Why? Because I really hope and I really wish, all of us, that in the future, the monopoly for some technologies like operational systems for mobile phones and so on, for smartphones, yes, will be broken by another players. Okay. Oh, let's China or Russia or other poles in the multipolar world, which means that hopefully we'll be able, if they block us in our, let's say, on the territory of our pole, let's say Western pole or African pole, yes, you might always use the technology offered by other pole and use it for your freedom of speech and for unbiased professional journalism. That's a hope. From that point of view, the idea, the concept of multipolar world might be really a let's say, refreshing prospect for the freedom of speech in the whole world, basically, yes, because every poll can use the instruments created by other poll to let's say broaden the sphere of the freedom of speech and the freedom of press.
Okay.
And that's why I wish we have the multipolar world. I wish to all the journalists, but also to the listeners and viewers, that you can access independent, unbiased information thanks to this multipolar world coming on our eyes, becoming a fact. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for that, MATEUSZ, quite insightful. Mobley, now as a historian and journalist, how can historical context aid in understanding the current media landscape, and what lessons from the past can be applied to promote peace and stability through media coverage to ensure indeed communication for development? Particularly, I know you are that proponent that has always advocated for African unity as the way towards solving continental problems. How can the media help in attaining this milestone? 2 minutes, please.
Absolutely, and I will adhere to your 2-minute rule. What I would hope that would happen at the conference next week in Nairobi, and I can't get there, I just found out about it today, but we need journalists to really take an introspective look and define the difference between journalism and disinformation. You know, the difference between journalism and propaganda and propagation of ideas that conflict with what would truly be journalistic. From my standpoint, give me the information, give me the facts, give me the salient points that I need, and I can make my own decision. Don't try and tell me what to think. And too much of corporate journalism is naturally devised around the idea of telling people what to think. That's what advertising is. That's exactly what we don't need in journalism. And unfortunately, some corporate-owned media can't even discern the difference. They don't even understand that they are, in fact, doing that. The deep state challenge is going to continue because any country that is allowing the central banks of Europe to print their currency and to run their banking systems has a deep state. That's what your deep state is. It's always about following the money, as Steve said. And, you know, Professor LAEED and also Paul MATEUSZ, I appreciate the comments and appreciate being on the panel with you guys, and would love to see this also continue and extend to next week after that conference so that we can do a wrap-up of that conference and look at the results of it.
Absolutely, yeah. The results are what matters and how they will go towards changing narratives across the world. Briefly with you, Professor LAEED, now in the context of journalism or citizen journalism, challenging traditional gatekeeping roles, how can countries, particularly in Africa, ensure that a diverse range of voices are heard while maintaining ethical journalistic standards that will bring about peace and development rather than promote war?
Thank you, Clarice. Let me, before answering your question, there is a point which really strikes me, is the question of ranking the press freedom in the world. Yeah. And unfortunately, we have Reporters Sans Frontières, the French non-governmental organization, Committee to Protect Journalists. We have IPI, International Press Institute, and so many other organizations, non-governmental organizations, which dare to rank freedom in the press according to their own standard. And I don't understand. So this is, in other words, they want to impose their logic, their view, and their standard of evaluation on countries which are completely different from theirs. And therefore, so many cases, we have a distortion of the reality. We cannot compare freedom of the press between Algeria or Nigeria with Denmark or Norway or Canada, because the context is not the same, the society is not the same. Therefore, there is a lot of misconception and misunderstanding. Now, coming back to this question of citizen and journalism, let's make it clear. Why there is a citizen journalism? Because for the only reason, present media stream in Africa did not meet the expectation and the need of the public. And therefore, because the public are not happy with what they get from the public media, therefore, they look for other sources, their other venue to get the information. That's one thing. The second thing, now we are facing this danger of citizen journalism, because you have citizens. I am not blaming them. I am not despising them. I am not condemning them. But what I am saying, they have no academic background. They have not been to the university. They don't know about the basics of journalism, neither about ethics or deontology. But they dare to report and to write in journalism without any sense of responsibility, and therefore it's very bad for journalism. What we need now, we need that this kind of journalism, citizen journalism, should catch up with the ethics, with the narratives, with the principle, and with the values of how to write journalism, because they are completely confusing between news and current affairs, and comment, and opinion, and this and that. And therefore, of course, citizen journalism is to blame, but on the other hand, the state should also consider that it's an opinion which should be considered in their policy for the future.
Okay, thank you so much. And we're ending with Steve Gill. Now the question is, given the faster pace nature of modern day media landscape, how do journalists navigate the balance between providing accurate information and breaking news feeds? First, I beg your pardon, especially in a politically charged environment like, let me see, the United States of America?
Well, I think it really comes down to experience and context. I think when I look at this panel, we share historical perspective, economic perspective, global perspective, and too many of the journalists today come right out of journalism school or college. They get handed a microphone and a camera, and they have no context. They have no historical perspective, and it's hard to cover difficult events if you really don't know the background that got us where we are, much less where we're headed. And I just want to commend you, Clarice, for pulling together a panel like this and allowing these kinds of conversations that don't take place often enough to put these things into context, historically and otherwise. And this is what will fix the problems. Smart, reasoned, credible conversations leading to solutions and new ideas, or maybe even finding old ideas that need to be actually put into place. And Clarice, thank you for what you're doing. Every time I come on one of your shows, I learn so much from my colleagues from around the world, and look forward to opportunities to meet again in person.
Indeed, and that is the prime objective of Global Insider, to communicate, to understand, to ensure a knowledge sharing platform with a panel of experts where we can actually bring about collaboration, compromise, with the sole aim of bringing constructive analysis to the major problems faced by the interconnected world, and see how we can can actually redefine the information order in a more in a world which is experiencing geopolitical competition, and also see how the era of multilateralism will ensure more peace and stability and more connected world rather than bring divergence like what we are seeing in contemporary society. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, gentlemen, for the great insight on today's edition of Global Insight. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insight to our millions of viewers out there. Thank you for trusting the Pan-African television. Remember that it is another view of the world, and we remain intentional about bringing to you news as it happens, bringing to you constructive news that will unite rather than divide. Thank you, and have a lovely moment in the company of our transmissions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.